The Temple of Reclamation deck has been around in Standard for quite a while. The new set, Theros Beyond Death, added meaningful new cards, making this deck an easy choice for your ladder play. Last weekend for the Mythic Qualifier, variations of this deck got 10-1 records, and this was seen during Worlds last month. Anyone that plays Standard knows that Temple of Reclamation is a top-tier deck in best of 3, so let's just jump into this guide. The list I'll be covering has a playset of Wilderness Reclamation, 3 copies of Brazen Borrower, 3 copies of Euro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, a playset of Opt, 3 copies of Thassa's Intervention, 3 copies of Mystical Dispute, 1 copy of Chemister's Insight, 1 copy of Negate. Moving on to the lands, we're playing 27 lands, starting off with a playset of Breeding Pool, Steam Vents, and Stomping Ground. 2 copies of Temple of Mystery, Temple of Epiphany, Temple of Abandon, and Castle Vantress, 3 copies of Fabled Passage, 1 forest, 2 islands, 1 mountain. Moving on to the sideboard, we have 3 copies of Aether Gust, 3 copies of Negate, 1 copy of Mystical Dispute, 1 copy of Storm's Wrath, 2 copies of Scorching Dragonfire, 2 copies of Chandra's Pyrohelix, 3 copies of Legion Warboss. Wrapping it up, here's the full 75 list. Pause the video for a screenshot if needed. The deck list import for MTGA will be in the description below, as well as a link to an image of the list too. So let's jump into the guide. First, let's break down the deck with some stats. There's 6 mythic rares, 37 rares, 12 uncommons, and 16 commons. The curve of this deck is averaging 3.1. Where this list has a ton of instants and sorceries to control the game and draw cards, there's only 6 creatures total. Breaking down the key cards. Of course, Wilderness Reclamation is a key card given the name of the deck. Wilderness Reclamation reads, at the beginning of your end step, untap all your lands you control, meaning you can cast more instants on your opponent's turn or at the end of your end step, or float more mana to cast a bigger spell. Speaking of bigger spells, the next card is Expansion Explosion, a split card. The expansion side reads, copy target instant or sorcery spell with converted mana cost 4 or less. You may choose new targets for that copy. The explosion side reads, explosion deals X damage to any target. Target player draws X cards. Most of the time you're aiming to float mana at the end of your end step to cast a big enough X with Wilderness Reclamation on the field to win the game. But expansion can be extremely helpful copying your own spells or your opponent's too. Finally, I had a hard debate on what I thought was more of a key card to display for the last card. Both my choices coming from the set, Theros Beyond Death. It was between Euro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, and what I ended up with displaying, Thassa's Intervention. Thassa's Intervention reads, choose one, look at the top X cards of your library. Put up to 2 of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any random order. The other option is, counter target spell unless its controller pays twice X. Thassa's Intervention works beautifully with Wilderness Reclamation when you don't have an explosion to cast to hopefully find that other copy of Expansion Explosion. It also doubles as a counterspell to your opponent's spells to deny an important card. The best part is that you can wait till the end of their turn to find which one you want to use and cast, so you can be more proactive or reactive. Okay, now that we know the basic, let's talk game plan. The obvious one, Wilderness Reclamation on the field and casting Explosion with X damage. Either to do X amount to draw another explosion to finish off the opponent the next turn, or to actually kill in 1 turn. Sometimes decking the opponent and making them draw cards off Explosion is another way to win. Euro escaping and Brazen Borrower swinging along with counters to control the field to be able to get that damage in. And 2 hot tips, make sure when you draw cards off Explosion that you have enough cards in your deck so you don't deck yourself. And don't forget to put a stop at the end of your turn when Reclamation is on the field, so floating mana is possible, and you'll see that in the gameplay. Turns 1 through 6 are pretty simple. Draw cards with Growth Spiral and Euro, ramping up your lands on the field. Overall, just trying to find a copy of Wilderness Reclamation. At this point in the game, you'll be drawing more cards and controlling the game as well as you can. At this point, you'll be putting down a land each turn, so you'll have quite a bit of land with Wilderness Reclamation, which means if you draw another one, it can make a bigger X amount for a one-shot kill. An important factor to keep in mind while casting Explosion is if you're playing against a deck that has instants to stop you from resolving Explosion, to keep mana up for a counter so Explosion resolves. Even though you might have enough damage to kill your opponent, foregoing that to draw cards and playing the long game might be a better option if the opponent has the probability of a counter in their hand. Jumping into the sideboards, we're going to go over the plan for Bant and Sultai mid-ramp, Rakdos Sacrifice, Temur Clover, Mono Red Aggro, Jeskai Fires, Azorius Control, and the Mirror. I would say these 6 decks are the S tier or A tier decks in the meta in March 2020 season. As you might know, the meta changes, and as a good Magic player, you'll need to adapt accordingly. I generally play Bant and Sultai mid-ramp the same, so what's coming in on games 2 and 3 are 1 copy of Mystical Dispute, 3 copies of Negate, 3 copies of Legion Warboss, 3 copies of Aethergust. What's coming out is a playset of Wilderness Reclamation, 2 copies of Expansion Explosion, 1 copy of Op, 3 copies of Storm's Wrath. I believe you're at a disadvantage here. Bant has Teferi, which deals, well, with our entire game plan of Wilderness Reclamation and Explosion. Sultai has Casualties of War, which has better targets saying that we have a creature, enchantment, and land. Control cards like Negate, Mystical Dispute, and Aethergust deny their key cards like Nissa Who Shakes the World, Hydroid Crisis, or even Hand Disruption. However, they're pretty slow to start, so adding Legion Warboss can get those hits in while your game plan is to deny everything they play that's a key card. Though Storm's Wrath seems like a helpful card, killing the 3/3s, generally when I have to play it, it's too late to come back, saying it never kills Nissa or Teferi if they've plussed, and we'll need to deal with them right away. Brazen Borrower is good versus their copy of Euro, so ours can swing. Next is Rakdos Sacrifice. Coming in is 2 copies of Chandra's Pyrohelix, 2 copies of Aethergust, 1 copy of Storm's Wrath, 2 copies of Scorching Dragonfire. Coming out is 1 copy of Brazen Borrower, 3 Mystical Disputes, 1 Negate, 1 Thassa's Intervention, 1 Expansion Explosion. We should always win late game. Our priority here is similar to Mono Red, kill all their creatures. Keep in mind that Claim the Firstborn is very good against our creatures, so make sure you're healthy enough to take a hit and possibly losing that creature to a sack. We want to deny their Mayhem Devil, Woe Strider, Midnight Reaper with either Chandra's Pyrohelix or Scorching Dragonfire, and gain life with Euro early to get to late game. Keep in mind, Scorching Dragonfire exiles, so the Cauldron Familiar won't be able to come back with the Witch Oven combo, but make sure they don't have a sack available when casting, or they'll just sack in response. Wilderness Reclamation Explosion is how we win this matchup most of the time. Temur Clover. Coming in, there's 3 copies of Aethergust, 3 copies of Negate, 2 copies of Scorching Dragonfire, 2 copies of Chandra's Pyrohelix. Coming out, 3 copies of Brazen Borrower, 3 copies of Storm's Wrath, 1 copy of Expansion Explosion, 1 copy of Thassa's Intervention, 2 copies of Mystical Dispute. Scorching Dragonfire and Chandra's Pyrohelix can kill their Edgewall Innkeeper along with a Brazen Borrower. Negate denies their Lucky Clover and their higher mana non-creature spells like Granted from Feyre Wishes, and whatever they've previously grabbed from their sideboard. Aethergust denies their play for the turn, giving you more of a chance to draw Wilderness Reclamation or Expansion Explosion. Brazen Borrower here is a pretty bad attacker, or bouncing their cards generally gives them more value to you than them, so we take all of them out. Mono Red Aggro. Coming in, 3 copies of Aethergust, 2 copies of Chandra's Pyrohelix, 1 copy of Storm's Wrath, 2 copies of Scorching Dragonfire. Coming out is 2 copies of Wilderness Reclamation, 1 copy of Expansion Explosion, 3 copies of Mystical Dispute, 1 copy of Chemister's Insight, 1 copy of Negate. We should always win late game. Our priority here is similar to Rakdos Sacrifice, killing their creatures. Keep in mind you don't always have to maximize the amount of creatures killed with Storm's Wrath. We want to deny their Annex Harden of the Forge with Scorching Dragonfire and gain life with Euro early. Aethergust is great at denying Embercleave or just creatures to buy more time. Chandra's Pyrohelix is extremely good for the amount of 1/1s they have. Wilderness Reclamation Explosion is how we generally win this matchup most of the time. We take out all the slow cards. But Mono Red is Mono Red, and sometimes they're too fast. Jeskai Fires. Coming in, 3 copies of Aethergust, 1 copy of Negate, 2 copies of Scorching Dragonfire, 1 copy of Mystical Dispute. Coming out, 2 copies of Wilderness Reclamation, 1 copy of Brazen Borrower, 2 copies of Expansion Explosion, 2 copies of Storm's Wrath. Jeskai Fires has Teferi, which completely ruins our game plan of Explosion and Wilderness Reclamation, so taking out a couple copies doesn't hurt. Mystical Dispute and Negate can deny Teferi and a Fires of Invention. Aethergust denies Fires of Invention for a turn, for a counter for the next turn. Scorching Dragonfire and Expansion can kill their Kenrith or their Cavalier of Flame. This is a rough matchup since they can scry whatever they need with Sphinx of Foresight or Castle Vantress. Azori's Control. Coming in, 3 copies of Negate, 1 copy of Mystical Dispute, 1 copy of Scorching Dragonfire, 3 copies of Legion Warboss. Coming out, 4 copies of Wilderness Reclamation, 1 copy of Expansion Explosion, 3 copies of Storm's Wrath. Counters are great in this matchup, denying cards like Teferi if he isn't on the board. We gain early game pressure with Legion Warboss, They have minimal creatures, so Storm's Wrath isn't great. Wilderness Reclamation is just a target for their exile enchantments, then their Teferi encounters, so we take all out. Our biggest priority here is not having Teferi on the board. The Mirror. Coming in, 3 copies of Aether Gust, 2 copies of Negate, 1 copy of Mystical Dispute, 1 copy of Scorching Dragonfire, 3 copies of Legion Warboss. Coming out, 4 copies of Wilderness Reclamation, 3 copies of Storm's Wrath, 2 copies of Expansion Explosion, 1 copy of Thassa's Intervention. For the Mirror, we're just going to counter and pressure the game with Euro, Brazen Borrower, and Legion Warboss. Aether Gust can deny an explosion. They board out Storm's Wrath usually, so there won't be much removal for Legion Warboss and their minions. We're playing this matchup very similar to Bant Sultai mid-ramp, with just ramping up lands, holding counters, and swinging when we can. Finishing up, here's a cheat sheet for all the decks we covered for your screenshot pleasure. Link is also in the description for an image of this as well. Here are some options for your deck. Metas evolve and you may be lacking some wild cards, so here are some other solid ideas for this deck. But don't be afraid to innovate from what I'm thinking of. Nissa Who Shakes the World. Nissa is always a bomb card in Standard, and she's playable in this deck too. Tapping for extra mana for the explosion and adding pressure with through 3 lands. Night Pack Ambusher. Another great card that gets out of control if you can't get rid of it, making more wolves. Generally, I've seen it played instead of Legion Warboss in the sideboard. I like Warboss better because it provides more early pressure, but this card is good too. Fry. Good against, well, 2 things. White and blue. Who's white and blue and completely ruins our deck? Teferi. It's also good against Jeskai Fires, with Kenrith the Return King, Cavalier of Gales, and Sphinx of Foresight. If you're running into that matchup a lot, try it and see where it takes you. Robber of the Rich. Better aggression against ramp decks and could steal away their cards. Please let it be Nissa. Thank you. Now, some gameplay with clips of 4 games I played. I got to play against 2 mono red decks where I went 2-0, 1 Bant ramp where I lost, and a Teamer Clover where I won. Thanks for watching this video. My name's Breanna, or BLT for short. Hopefully you crushed the ladder with some wins, and if you didn't, I'm sorry. Please like this video anyways so I can make videos on the decks you lost to. I personally stream on Twitch Tuesdays through Friday at 8 p.m. Central Time. Come hang out and chat and watch some more Magic gameplay. I would love to see you there. twitch.tv/Breanna. We also have a Discord where you can talk more Magic, gaming, or memes with the community. All the links are in the description below, along with the deck infographics. Good luck winning and climbing the ladder to Mythic this season, guys.